soldiers and sailors who lived there. There was an abundance of oak and pine in this area, so the buildings were pretty much log, except for the officers. They got that nice brick building to live in, and they made the brick out of clay from the banks of the Pine River. And until the 1920s, we continued to do that. So a lot of buildings in St. Clair are made of local brick, like the building we're in. It's that reddish, orangish red color. This log cabin era in Michigan really didn't last very long, and we really don't have a picture of a St. Clair log house, but probably not too much different from this. Except we do know that there is a log house in the middle of this one. It is on the corner of Clinton and 9th Streets, and was added on to a couple of times at least. And a log house sort of disappeared under the rest of it. And a reason why the log cabin era didn't last long here was the sawmills came very quickly after the first settlers arrived and produced lumber for frame houses. This was one of 8 sawmills that were in and around the city of St. Clair by the mid-1800s. So it was one of our first major industries. And this is a good example of the type of frame house that was built in the early 1800s here. It's the oldest house we know of, at least so far. Today it's on the corner of 7th and J Streets, right across the street from St. Peter's Church. But originally, it was on 2nd near Adams, which would put it in the parking lot behind the mall. And it was not moved here because of urban renewal. It was moved to this location back in the 1920s. Mr. Woodruff here built the house. He came here in 1832, lived for a year in a hotel while he built this, and eventually went home to New England and brought a wife back. He was a cabinet maker and a carpenter. In 1873, he's listed as an undertaker, which kind of, I guess, goes along with being a cabinet maker. He made the coffins. The house actually became larger. This is the original part, but he eventually added on to that right side, and it was an addition about the size of the current house. But I think they were separated when it was moved here. These are 2 other 1830s houses that we have identified. The top one is just down the street from us between 3rd and 4th on Cass, although originally it wasn't there either. Originally in 1834, it was on Trumbull, between where the post office and Frederick's funeral home are today. And probably was moved to this location in the 30s when they built the post office. The one on the bottom is on Clinton, and it was built in 1838 by a man named Levi Clow. We really don't know anything about him other than he built this house. The one on the bottom, by the way, would have originally looked almost identical to this house. So the windows were changed over the years, and that makes a big difference. By the 1840s, even in the 1830s, in this area, you're beginning to get a number of Greek Revival houses built. And this is a very nice example. It's on 7th between Trumbull and J. And it was built 1844, 1845. Now, Greek Revival began to be popular really after the American Revolution. It was promoted by Thomas Jefferson, who himself was an architect. And the idea is to copy Greek and Roman temples. And you can see that there in the portico. You've got the pediment and the columns like a Greek temple. This was a one-story house originally, now it's two-story. It was built by the man in the upper right, Marcus Miles. And he came to, well, it's in the next slide. That's his son, by the way, Edwin Miles. They both, father and son, fought in the Civil War. Marcus Miles came to Sinclair in 1838. He had lived in Marine City for several years before that, where he was the postmaster, but then he was the county clerk, and Sinclair was the county seat. So he moved up here, and he also became the registrar of deeds. In the 1850s, he got his law degree, was admitted to the bar of Sinclair County, and soon was a judge and held several different judges' positions in the 1850s. When the Civil War came, he and Simeon Brown from Sinclair organized the 11th Michigan Cavalry. Brown in Detroit recruited men. Miles went to Kalamazoo and recruited men, and he became the quartermaster of the 11th Michigan. Soon, however, he began to be appointed to basically military judge positions in the Army. When the war was over, he came back home here, was elected to the state legislature. Then he, in 1870, the president appointed him Inspector of Customs in Toronto. So he spent then several years in Toronto. He retired in the late 1870s, came home, and died of actually of injuries he suffered in the Civil War. Some internal injuries he had when he fell off of a train in Pennsylvania. His wife got the military pension based on medical reasons, not just that he served. In 1892, the house was purchased by Russ and his wife, Grace Jenks. And both Russ Jenks and Grace Kitten grew up in Sinclair. They were born here, they grew up here. The house at that time included the entire block, the city block, which was not unusual in a lot of Sinclair. Jenks's family had been involved in what became a commercial and savings bank from its beginnings as the National Bank of Sinclair in 1871. He became president of the bank in 1918 when his brother Charles died. Russ Jenks was on the school board for 30 years. He was mayor in 1908. And he was one of the founding members of the Rotary Club. Now, another Greek Revival house is this one. It's on Brown at Vine. I'm on 9. I should know that. I live on 9. It was built in 1847. Now, it is also Greek Revival, but it is different from the other one. This is kind of late Greek Revival, 1840s, 1850s, and it still has the elements, though, as you can see, you know, this right. And the pediment here is like the Greek temple. This one is not a closed one like a lawn, but originally this would have been this two-story rectangular house. Later on, this addition on the side was added, and on the back, and sometime in the late 1800s, these bay windows. So it was, over the years, enlarged, Victorianized a bit with the porch, the bay windows, and it was built by this man, Simeon B. Brown, or he was often just called S.B. Brown. Brown had come to Detroit quite a few years before he came here, and he learned the hotel business from the #1 hotel owner in the state, Ben Woodruff, or not Woodruff, Woodworth, who owned the state's best hotel. It was right on the waterfront, the Steamboat Hotel in Detroit. And then he married Ben Woodworth's daughter. They lived not up here immediately, but over near Kalamazoo for several years. Then came to St. Clair because he got a 5-year lease to run the Exchange Hotel, which is here, or the Sinclair Exchange. It was on the waterfront at the foot of Trumbull Street. It was the main hotel in town. There was another, but this was the hotel. There was a dock right there where steamboats stopped. At the end of his lease in 1849, he built his own hotel with the help of his father-in-law, who built a house next door. He retired up here. This was on Riverside at Cass, and actually it eventually went from Riverside along Cass all the way to 2nd Street. And it was quite the hotel. It was the kind of social center of St. Clair. When the Civil War came, Brown joined the 11th Michigan Cavalry, was a colonel, fought in Tennessee, and then into Virginia, where he was made a general after the Battle of Marion, Virginia. And then he and his troops fought in one of the very last campaigns of the war in the East, around Asheville, North Carolina, and into western South Carolina. When the war ended, he came home to St. Clair, and he no longer owned his hotel here. There it is. We are right here. The library is here today. He no longer owned it, but he managed it for its owner. And in fact, he and his second wife and her daughter lived in the hotel in the early 1870s. And lived there when it burned in 1873. Escaping with their lives and not much more. The house he had built later on was part of the Gannon Dairy Farm. The Vern Campbell family lived here for many years. It became divided into, I think there are 4 apartments. Another Greek Revival house, and this is really what I think is kind of the epitome of the late Greek Revival. This picture obviously wasn't recent, but I like it because it still has some of the old wooden shutters on it, which when they finished painting, they never put back. But you can see this is a Greek temple. By this latter period, the facade of the temple kind of is receded into the house. You have the triangle up here, this one, the pediment is closed. These represent the columns. And everything is very ordered, very balanced. Where you have one opening, you have another. So if you have 3 windows here, you have 3 openings right below here. It's a beautiful example of that type of house. This 1-story portion was actually built first. And the man who built it was Eugene Smith. And he built that as a school for his sister Ora to run. That's Eugene Smith's desk there. It's upstairs. Now Eugene Smith, his sister died the following year. So I was only at school for 1 year. At that point, Eugene Smith married Margaret Goff, and he built the two-story section onto it, and then they spent the rest of their lives living in it. And their son George also did, and he died in the 1930s. And that is George at about the age of 5. Eugene Smith was a sawmill owner. Actually, he was a boy when he came here in the 1830s with his family, and his father, Elijah, started the sawmill right at the southern city limits on the Sinclair River. And Elijah died young, leaving a young Eugene Smith to take care of his sisters and his mother, which he apparently did quite well. He ran the sawmill, he bought timberlands, he got into owning ships or parts of ships. He would own portions of them, such as this one, which is the Caliuga, the largest ship built at the Langell Yard on the Pine River here. He also enjoyed farming, and he owned 2 quite large farms. One north of town on the St. Clair River, about 3 miles north, and another in Smith's Creek, which they tell me that's how Smith's Creek got its name. And he liked to breed cattle on his farms and was quite noted as a cattle breeder. What you have up there is from the cover of one of his lumber sales logs, which we have here in the museum. In 1940, the house was purchased by Kay Balfour, or I guess she also was called Katie Balfour. And her father, Watt Balfour, helped her buy it. He was a carpenter, so he helped turn it into apartments. And then she lived there the rest of her life. And of course, she was a well-known teacher in the area. A lot of you probably had her as a teacher. She died in 2002, and at that point, the house was sold. Now, this is another Greek Revival house on North Riverside. You can see on the top, that kind of typical Greek Revival look. It's this rectangle. You've got the kind of elaborate pediment, the pilasters, those boards that represent columns on the corner. It was built about 1848 by a man named Robert Scott. Now, I don't think he ever lived here, because Robert Scott was an early builder of homes in St. Clair and built a number that were very similar to this. So we don't know who originally lived in it, but we do know that by 1860 it was owned by Mrs. Reuben Moore, and that's her there. She owned it for about 8 years, and during that time she allowed the Congregational Church to use it as the home for their minister. Now, from this drawing by Virginia Avison, you can kind of get a better idea of what the house originally was like. The bay windows were added in the 1870s. Now, in 1868, the lady up in the top was going to get married, and she was Emily Owen. And her aunt was Emily Ward of Marine City, and her uncle was Emily's brother, Eber B. Ward, or Eber Brock Ward. And they were niece and nephew of Samuel Ward of Marine City, who had the shipyard owned a very large steamship line, and were basically his heirs. Eber Ward went on to be Michigan's first millionaire industrialist, owning steel mills, lumber mills, and a variety of other things. And Emily Ward was very much involved in those businesses, although most people don't give her credit for that. When they were building steamships in Marine City, she was in charge of the interior design. She also is said to have been her brother Eber Ward's best advisor, business advisor, and behind the scenes had a lot of influence on his decisions. They say she was a better business person than her brother. Their niece was Emily Owen, and Emily's parents died when she was young, so Emily Ward raised her and raised some other nieces and nephews. So when Emily Owen was going to marry Justin R. Whiting of St. Clair, she was presented with this house as a wedding gift. And they lived here for the next 25 years, I think, about that. Had 9 children that they raised there. Emily Whiting's obituary said that she was her husband's most trusted and valued advisor. And the drawing there is from her obituary in the Sinclair Republican. Now, her husband, Justin Whiting, was a son of Colonel Henry Whiting, who had come to St. Clair in the 1840s and opened a dry goods store and did well, and fought in the Civil War, came home and built a 3rd store, this one. It was the largest department store in St. Clair County. It was on the corner of Riverside and J. So it was right in the parking lot of the bank. It sold virtually everything. Justin Whiting ended up running the store after his father died, or even before his father died. But he also had interests in diamond crystal salt and the Ward Lumber Company, which was in Chicago, but was the nation's largest lumber company, and lots of other things, including the Wonder Plow Company, which was located in St. Clair, and manufactured a device that went on plows that was supposed to make plowing easier. I think that factory was over on 2nd Street, South 2nd here. Justin Whiting, though, also was a noted politician. He was a Democrat who was elected to 4 terms, served 8 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. He really had wanted to become governor, but failed to get the party to nominate him in the 1890s. In 1898, he was a big supporter of William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president that year. And they were friends, and William Jennings Bryan came here to St. Clair several times and stayed with the Whitings, spoke at the Methodist Church. And Bryan was, certainly the greatest orator of his day. The Whitings in 1893 left that house on North Riverside that they had lived in and moved into a brand new house. They built a little further up the street on the river, and it was called Belle Reve. But the old house didn't sit empty too long, because their daughter, Pamelia, married Hannibal A. Hopkins in 1898, and they gave them this house. And they spent the rest of their lives living here. Hannibal Hopkins was not related to any of the other Hopkins in St. Clair. He had come here from Lansing in the early 1890s, was hired by the owner of the St. Clair Republican newspaper, who was Franklin Moore, to come and publish the paper, and eventually he came to own it. This was their office. It was in the old Congregational Church, which was where the post office is today, Trumbull and Second. Hannibal Hopkins also was the postmaster for 29 years. And since he printed a lot of things in his business, he also published the Postmaster Association's magazine. He was part of the Port Huron Chamber of Commerce, the Southeastern Michigan Tourism and Publicity Council. He was a busy man. Their daughter was Rosamond. She was born in the house in 1900. She went to college. Once she graduated, she married a man named Henry Earl, but they divorced in 1927. But she continued to live in the house until she died in 1973. And she was kind of a local historian, too. Now, Justin Whiting's brother was Henry Whiting. And this is the house that Henry Whiting, Jr. built on North Riverside in 1905. And it's a beautiful shingle house. Looks exactly like it did in 1905. Now this Henry Whiting, he made his career primarily at Diamond Crystal Salt Company. The family had, from the beginning, had an interest in diamond crystal, and he eventually became its president. And his hat and riding crop are over here on the table. On 9th Street, right at the head of J, is this house. It's another Greek revival. It's built about 1854. This is the house as it looked in 1868. There's a bird's eye view map of Sinclair made in 1868, and all the houses are drawn in. So you see it was a typical upright and winged Greek revival, no porch. And it was built by Robert H. Jenks and his wife, Mary Clark. And Mary Clark was the first person Robert Jenks met when he came to St. Clair. And he came here about 1850. And the Clark family had a farm down in East China where the Edison plant is. And they had a dock, and the steamboats would stop there, take on fuel, get crops farmers in the area were shipping out, or parcels they were delivering. And when a steamboat stopped there, she was on the dock, and he met her. But he didn't stay in St. Clair very long. He went up to Lexington soon and worked in a store, and then came back to St. Clair, and they were married in 1854. And spent the rest of their lives in this house. He was mayor. He was postmaster. He died in 1892. The lots on that side of 9th Street, that west side, were originally 5-acre lots. So there was a lot of room behind this, and they had an orchard and a barn and a lot of things. And the family reunions for years were held in the backyard in the orchard. And we do have over on the table here an 1897 program from their family reunion. And they had a Toastmaster. They had people who gave speeches, read poems, led songs, the whole bit. In 1908, the city celebrated its 50th anniversary as a city. And after they had all the speeches downtown, the community came here and had a big community picnic in their backyard. Now on 6th and J is this brick house, and this is Sinclair made brick. It was built, well, we aren't exactly sure who built it. John Bowen owned it, probably built it and then owned it until 1856. In 1877, it was purchased by Samuel Hopkins, who was a brother of the Mark Hopkins of San Francisco, who earned all the millions and left his brother Samuel with $5 million. So he bought this house and we think lived here while he was building his mansion up on North Riverside. And then sold it to his son Mark Hopkins, who probably lived here while he was building his next door. This is the other side of the house. In 1889, there were 4 sisters who bought the house. They were the Born-Traeger sisters, they're referred to. 3 of them ran a dressmaking business in the house. The other sister worked as a secretary. Their brother lived here for a short time. He ran a blacksmith shop, Born-Traeger's, which was on 2nd Street, so it would be down by Palmer Manor. And this is just up the street on 6th and Trumbull. We're not sure exactly when this was built. It was there in 1854. And we don't know who built it. But we do know that in the late 1800s it was the home of Bella and Sarah Jenks. Now, Bella Jenks was the brother of Robert. And he actually was here before Robert. And here you can see it in 1868. It is right there. So it didn't have a porch, didn't have bay windows. Kind of a typical house of the era. After the Jenks bought it, they added the bay windows, they put a porch on. It was a very large house, but Bella Jenks was well educated. He was college educated before he came here. He taught school for a year after he came here. Then he went into business, a variety of businesses. He had a hay business with his brother Robert. They had a huge dock down on the waterfront with a big hay barn on it, and hay and other farm produce were shipped out. He also was into real estate, lumbering interest, and banking. He was twice elected a state senator, member of the State Board of Education, and he was on the Sinclair Board of Education for 40 years, and when he died, his son Russ became a member. So between them, they were on the Board of Education for 70 years straight. By 1907, both of the Jenkses had died, and the house was sold to become the Sinclair Community Hospital. An association was put together to purchase it. A loan was taken out. Not too many improvements were made to it to really make it into a hospital, but in 1912, Miss Anna Tuckley was hired from Sarnia General Hospital to take charge, and she did. For many years, Miss Tuckley ran the hospital and ran it sometimes rather inventively. She had the school students can food for the hospital. She had the other students, repair furniture, all sorts of things. She borrowed things from the Sarnia General Hospital. So she made it into a true hospital, and kind of led the fight to build a new one in 1927, which stood right behind this. And she moved here. She had a 5-room apartment on the 2nd floor. The old hospital became an apartment building. This little house is on 5th and Vine. And it's a very old house. I'm not actually positive. It was built in 1852. It could have been built a little bit earlier. Originally, the room here was not a part of it. It was added on later, and it did not have a porch. So a 1-story frame structure, and whoops, it was purchased in 1852 to be the parsonage for the Methodist Church. They hadn't built the church yet, but they wanted to attract a minister, and so by having a house, they were able to do that. In 1887, they're going to, wait a minute, something's wrong here. Yeah. They will build this one next to the Methodist Church on the corner of Vine and 3rd. And then the minister will move from the other house to this one. And the man who was brought here as minister to build this new house was the Reverend Thomas Huckle. He and his wife Bertha were from England. They came to Michigan when they were very young, served in several churches first, like in Elmont, and then came here. And he was able to get this church built. However, he died 2 years later at the age of 33, leaving his wife and several children. So, you know, she's this young widow with these young children, and, you know, what are you going to do? She decided to stay here. They knew people. The church supported them. And Henry Whiting, by then, owned the house. He had purchased it from the church, I think probably so they would have the money then to start building the new house. In 1893, Bertha Huckle is able to buy the house from the Whiting estate. And she continued to raise her children here and live here the rest of her life. And I think a member of the church also helped her pay the $600 to buy it. The new parsonage is going to be moved in 1972, and it today is on 4th Street, almost to the end. Now this one we all recognize because we drive Riverside a lot, and it's very prominent. It was built by Captain Henry Fish, and probably around the time of the Civil War. This style of architecture, it's kind of Italianate, was popular at the time. Italianate typically has brackets like that, which often you have more of them, but this house, I don't know if it did or not. Captain Fish was a ship's captain, and he lived a long life, 1824 to 1919. He captained some of the ships that were built right here in Sinclair, like these two, the Kalkaska and the Oscoda and the Ogama and some others. But he also was a part owner of these ships. And they basically were lumber ships. They would go up to places like Tawas and haul logs back to Sinclair to be sawn into lumber, or they would go to the mills up there at various places on the lakes and haul the finished lumber. Now this house is right across the street back here. We know it was the home of Adam Haste in the 1880s and probably before that. He was one of the local funeral directors, and here is the house with his hearse. And probably his photograph was taken in the 1880s because we have this ad where he is talking about his new hearse, which looks like the same one. I believe the ad's from 1883. So he lived here, operated his business from this house, which this is what it looks like today. On North 6th is kind of a gem of Second Empire style houses. This style was made popular in France and became very popular in the U.S. also after the Civil War. This house was built by a man named Gaynor Fox in 1865. And Gaynor Fox, his family lived on a farm near here, and one of his obituaries just said he was a farmer. But he wasn't. He actually was a ship's captain and captained a number of ships for quite a few years, and built this house in town, which is distinguished, of course, by the mansard roof. Ebenezer Fox in the picture. That picture was taken about the time this house was built. And I don't know if it's his brother or his son, but I'm thinking brother. Now up the street here at the corner of Trumbull and 6th is this house. It was built about 1885 by a German immigrant by the name of Gus Strauss. And the Strausses came from Germany. He had a brother in St. Clair, so he came here with his wife, Rosina. They stayed here briefly. His brother owned a store. They went on to other Thumb area towns, ran stores, and came back to St. Clair in 1865 and opened a store here, which burned several years later, but he had insurance, so he built himself a bigger store, which was on Trumbull between Riverside and 2nd. And it would sell groceries and provisions, other things, but mainly groceries. Was in business for 2 generations. Gus Strauss was an alderman, treasurer of the city, and mayor. And they had 2 sons, Fred and Christian. And Fred and his wife, Louisa, lived in the house afterward. And that's Fred and Louisa. And this is the house, late 1800s. It's a beautiful house. A lot of detail. And it was the home of the Eddy family in later years. Theo Eddy was superintendent of schools here for a long time. He was hired actually in 1930 as the superintendent when he still was a young man of 37. And this was their longtime home. One of the things he did as superintendent is the construction of the St. Clair Elementary School in 1938-39. And so in later years, the school was named after him. 9th Street, 9th and J. This is another kind of a classic Michigan home. It's upright in wing, it's 2-story with a 1-story wing, built that way. And it's also often referred to as a Michigan T because they're all over the state. It was built by the Reverend James Sutton, who was a Methodist minister who came here some years before that, in 1853. Now remember, the Methodists bought that house in 52, they hired this man to build that little church. It looks like it's part of this factory, but that's a little church, and it was the Methodist church they built in 1853 on the corner of Cass and 2nd. He then went on to other churches, other places, but the Suttons returned to Sinclair when he retired, and they built this house on the corner of 9th and J. Over the years, that north wing there that was added, and kitchen, summer kitchen on the back. Their daughter, who actually graduated from Sinclair High School in 1883, lived in the house after her parents and spent most of her life in this house. She was a music teacher. Then after her death, it was purchased by the Brenners. And this is Henry Brenner. His father had started a shoe shop here. Henry Brenner later also worked for Chris Kraft. And they bought the house in either 43 or 44. And the old family shoe shop was here on J Street, this building. It was right on the corner of J and 2nd. So in that parking lot that's behind the bank. And Lee's Bar was next door. And this is what the house looked like when the Brenners bought it. A little overgrown. Stella hadn't done much with it. So the overgrown shrubbery was removed. They put a new porch on, new foundation, and then the Brenners lived there for some time. Henry Brenner was trying to build a couple boats. So where do you build it? In the back bedroom. So here he is, bringing the boat out of the bedroom window, and then they had to lower it to the ground. And here's Betty and Ron helping to bring the boat out. A different style we don't see often here in the Sinclair area is this house at 408 Thorn Apple. It was built in 1898 by another ship captain, William Crockett. It has elements of what we refer to as Romanesque architecture, or the Roman arches is the main thing, but also kind of a heavy look, because Romanesque means Roman-like, and the real Romanesque architecture came in the very late Roman Empire when they weren't building things quite as well as maybe before. Things were cruder, heavier. But there was, in the late 1800s, a Boston architect by the name of Richardson, and he kind of copied a lot of Romanesque elements and made it quite popular, especially on the East Coast, and especially for public buildings. Not as much for houses like this. But I did read once that the best example of Romanesque in Michigan, or Richardsonian, is in Port Huron. In military, that house called the Castle. Big stone house, and stone or brick that looks like stone was part of the elements. Now we're going to have several Queen Anne style houses, and this was a late Victorian style, 1890s. There are three beautiful ones in a row on 5th Street. By the late Victorian period, they're copying every style of architecture there was, and often combining elements of different styles throughout history. But Queen Anne typically has porches like this, a tower, Lots of fancy woodwork that could be produced in factories. Leaded glass, stained glass windows. On the insides, lots of woodwork, built-in cabinets, cupboards. In Michigan, often that's oak, sometimes other wood, hardwoods. This one was built by a man named Edward C. Ricourt. And he actually didn't live here too long, but they built this, and then they built another house next door and moved there. In between them is the carriage house, and he built that with this house, but when he built the one next door, he took the carriage house too. So, later on, Captain Herbert Finnegan and his family lived here, and another Great Lakes ships captain. But all three of these houses are perfect condition as far as the way they originally looked. This is the one they built next door, and in 1897. And their son after them lived here, Harry Ricourt, and it stayed in the family until 1968. The architect was a local Port Huron architect named Herb. You see all the elements. You have the tower, you have the porch, you have the fancy woodwork. This one particularly has, here, all that stuff could be made in factories. The windows up here are curved glass. There's stained glass and leaded glass in the windows. Now the Ricourt family is one of the oldest in this area. The original Ricourt moved here in 1802 and lived on a farm down where the Edison plant is, where Ricourt Road ended on the river. And the Ricourts, they had a dock, they sold firewood to steamships, they shipped goods in and out, so it was more than a farm. And then they prospered there. And then E.C. or Edward Ricourt moved into town, and he built this store on South Riverside, a big store, and sold farm implements, feed, all sorts of things like that, and hardware. In 1909, he and his son, Harry, who is right there, opened Ricourt and Smith, or Ricourt. Smith was a partner, he'd taken in as a partner. One of the state's first Ford dealerships. And supposedly Henry Ford came up here for the opening of that, but we don't have proof of that.
That's true.
It's true. Okay. It is supposed to be the oldest Ford dealership in the state today. It later on was owned by Lowe's, and there's a big painting of the Lowe's Ford garage, which was right across Riverside from the old one. And then eventually they moved out to Kearney Drive. Now, a block down the street on 5th and Adams, but it faces 5th, is this Queen Anne. And it's another beautifully preserved house. And it was built by a ship captain, Wesley Brown, for his first wife, Louise Scott. And it's a rather impressive house, but Captain Brown at the time was the captain of the most prestigious passenger ship on the Great Lakes, the Northland. And then the following year, her sister ship, which was identical, the Northwest, which were owned by the Great Northern Railroad. And Captain Brown had a long career. He started at 14 sailing on the Great Lakes. Moved his way up. First he commanded tugboats, later schooners, steamers. In 1874, he had the distinction of hauling the largest raft of logs ever down the St. Clair River from Tawas to, I think all the way to Buffalo, which across Lake Erie, that would have been difficult. They actually had 2 tugs, and this was, he was captain of this one. But here's the Northland. They were beautiful ships. But the Browns soon sold this house, and we're not sure why, except we do know that he no longer worked for the Great Northern Railroad, and whether it was finances or what. But the McBride family bought it, and they owned it until 1907 when they sold it to the Congregational Church, who used it as a manse until 1935. And the best known minister who lived there was this man, Clarence Burkholder, who was a very well-liked minister, but he also was a poet, a calligrapher, an artist, and we have, I think, hundreds of pieces that he created like these.
Yes.
Every school, every club, every organization seemed to have him create programs and all sorts of things. Menus for the Sinclair Inn he did. And one of his books of poetry. When he retired from the ministry, he moved to Port Huron and opened an art craft studio, which I thought was just a studio of his own, but actually I found out that that was a franchise, and it was a printing studio. His son, who also was named Clarence, was a hero, wounded in World War II, and he came home after the war and became editor of the Times Herald. Before the war, he was a reporter there. In 1935, the Congregational Church sold the house and built this one on the corner next to the church. It's a colonial style. It was very popular in the 30s. I think we often think of the 30s and we might think of things very sleek and modern, Art Deco styles. But that was popular, but there also was this movement to look backward and revive colonial style architecture and particularly interior design. And this architect in Port Huron, Walter Wyeth, who also designed the inn, designed this house. You notice, you can see on the corners, there's what's called coining, which we'll see in another house too. This was Frederick's funeral home. These are the only 2 original pictures we have of what it looked like. It's a big house. In fact, we don't know who built it. But it was purchased in 1891 by Harry and Elizabeth Dale. And Elizabeth Dale was Elizabeth Smith, the daughter of Eugene Smith, whose house is just a block up the street. And Captain Dale, in 1891-2, he and his partner, Bobby, which originally was spelled like baby, Fred Bobby, and they changed the spelling later on. They owned a dock at the foot of Witherell, which is where the big steamships landed, ships stopped for coal, that sort of thing. He also was the captain of some ships, and most notably, the ferry steamer Welcome. So they raised their family in that house. This is his family. See, his son was named after Eugene Smith. And then it became Frederick's funeral home. Lawrence Fredericks started this business in 1919 in Marine City. He had a furniture store, and it was very typical for furniture stores to also have undertaking businesses. And he did, and over the years had in the furniture store at least several partners, including a Smith, and in the flour sifter, it's Roll is his partner. Later, he was located in the basement of the post office on Riverside, and in 1936, they bought this house and moved the business here. Now, this is just up the street at the corner of Casson 9, and it's kind of a typical bungalow of the teens, the 20s, the 30s, even into the 40s. It's a style that was kind of pioneered by some brothers, the Green brothers, who were architects in Southern California. It was built by Tom Miller and his wife Addie. Tom Miller was the chief engineer on the Lake Freighters. And they lived here quite a while and then moved to North Riverside in a house that's very similar to this. But one thing I find interesting about it is it's a kit home. They purchased it from the Aladdin Company in Bay City. And Bay City was the third largest manufacturer of kit homes in the country. And one of their avenues of selling these houses was through Sears catalogs. This is a picture from one of the Aladdin catalogs, I think 1918. And it is almost identical to the house up here on Cass. And this is their catalog. And if you want to see these catalogs are all online to the Clark Library at Central Michigan University. Aladdin went out of business in the 1980s. Their building sat empty for a while, and then I think in the 90s, or even after, someone bought the building and found all kinds of records, books, materials that the company just left. And they were all donated to the Clark Library at Central. It's their biggest collection. On South 10th, last house on South 7th. If you know where the farmer's market is there in that parking lot, okay, this is kitty corner from that. It was the birthplace of Theodore Goulet, or Goula, and his nickname was Snooze. He was born in the house in 1889. His father was Fred, who worked in the brickyard that was across the street where the golf course is. Snooze Goula, or Goulet, is the only baseball player from St. Clair who played for the major leagues. And then he played for a year or so for the Giants. But in 1912, he was on the team when they played in the World Series against the Boston Red Sox. They didn't win. Snooze was a pitcher. He didn't get to pitch in that game either. But he got his bonus for being on the team during the game. When the war came, World War I, that kind of ended the career, his career in baseball. And he went into the Army, served in France, was wounded, came home, and got a job as the Assistant Sergeant at Arms for the Michigan State Senate. And he became kind of a hero when a fire broke out in the archives room of the Senate. And he emptied like 12 fire extinguishers before the fire department got there. He saved a lot of public documents, although a number were also destroyed. He eventually came home to this house, lived in St. Clair for a while, and was a Michigan conservation officer. In 1936, he died at the age of 47. Now, Brown and Third is this brick house, which again is kind of that colonial, 30s, 40s, colonial revival style. And you can see the coining here maybe better on the corners, the brickwork in the corners. The distinguished person who lived here was State Senator Frank Beedle. The Beedles had lived on North 5th Street, but then in 1950 they bought this house and moved here. Now, Frank Beedle had also served in World War I. After the war, he came home to Sinclair, or he came to Sinclair. He was from Melvin up in the Thumb. And he came here to open an insurance agency. And it was in that building on Riverside. And that building was originally a house built in the 1840s. He had a Secretary of State office there for a number of years. He was very important member of the Lions Club, one of the founders, and very active in the state organization. And he was very active in the American Legion. He, as part of the Lions, was one of the ones who spearheaded the drive to build Pine Shores Golf Course, which then the following year they turned over to the city. He loved to say things in rhyme. And he even would do that on the floor of the state senate, particularly to irritate somebody. So he wrote poetry. He published a couple of books of poetry too. As a state senator, he was a Republican. He served from 1950 to 68. He was a member of the Appropriations, or really the Ways and Means Committee. In fact, at one time he was chairman. He was a member of the Education Committee. And in the early 60s, he was the Republican leader in the Senate, until his own party kicked him out of that job. And it was because the state was in financial trouble in the early 60s. And he favored instituting the state income tax, which enough members of his party didn't like, so he lost his leadership position. Now here he is with Governor Williams. We also have a picture of him with Governor Romney, but they were closer together in this picture. In the block just west of us is this house. It's brick, mostly. It does have, even the brick part has some on the back, that's wood. It was built in 1846 as the county jail, and it at that time was even our third county jail. It only was the county jail for a few years, and then in the 1850s, we built a larger one, which stood right here in the corner where the hospital later was. Then it became this house. And that extension originally was a school. It was located near the jail. It was built in 1845, and Eugene Smith's other sister, Frances, was the teacher. Then, when that school was abandoned because they built this bigger one right over here next to this building, it was sold, moved, added on to the house. The Louis Bauman family lived here later, and Emma Bauman ran a beauty shop in it. This is just up the street here too on Cass, between 6th and 7th. No, 7th and 8th. It looks like a barn because it was. It's a house that was turned into a barn quite a few years ago, but it was a barn owned by that man on the top. He was a Watkins salesman, and he had his wagon and his horse and would travel the countryside selling Watkins products. And he kept his horse and his wagon in that barn, which you can see in the bottom photo. It's still a barn there. The house still looks like that. It hasn't changed too much. That's it.
Wow.